My husband secretly invested all our savings in his girlfriend's property business. While I trusted him, the notification from my bank app appeared at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, just as I was reviewing quarterly reports for our small accounting firm. Large withdrawal alert. $94,500 transferred from joint savings account. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. $94,000, nearly every penny we'd saved over 8 years of marriage, gone in a single transaction I never authorized. My name is Cassia Wesley. I'm 34 years old, and I thought I knew my husband better than anyone in the world. For 8 years, Michael and I had been the perfect team. He ran his construction business while I managed our finances with the precision that made me successful at Wesley Associates Accounting. Every dollar earned, every expense tracked, every investment carefully planned for our future. That future just evaporated with a single bank notification. My hands trembled as I opened our banking app, praying this was some kind of error. But there it was, clear as day. A wire transfer to Meridian Property Development LLC, processed at 2:15 p.m., right in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon when Michael was supposedly at a job site in Riverside, supervising the renovation of a small office building. The timing felt deliberate, calculated. Michael knew I always reviewed our accounts on Tuesday afternoons. He knew I'd see this transaction within hours of it happening. Either he wanted me to find out, or he was so confident in whatever scheme he was running that he didn't care about hiding it anymore. I stared at my phone screen until the numbers blurred together. Meridian Property Development. I'd never heard of that company in my life, and as someone who handled all our business relationships and financial partnerships, that was impossible, unless Michael had been deliberately keeping secrets. My first instinct was to call him immediately, demand an explanation, assume there had to be some reasonable justification for moving our entire life savings without discussing it with me. But something made me pause, a cold whisper of intuition that said gathering information first might be smarter than reacting emotionally. Instead of calling, I opened my laptop and began investigating. Meridian Property Development LLC had been incorporated in California just 6 weeks ago. The registered agent was someone named Victoria Sterling, a name that meant absolutely nothing to me. But when I searched for Victoria Sterling real estate, everything suddenly made horrible sense. She was 26 years old, blonde, and according to her professional headshots, exactly the type of woman who turned heads at networking events. Her LinkedIn profile showed she'd recently left a position at a major Los Angeles real estate firm to start her own property investment company. Her Instagram was filled with photos of luxury homes, expensive cars, and motivational quotes about taking risks to build wealth. But it was her Facebook page that made my stomach drop completely. Photo after photo of her at construction sites, touring properties, and celebrating new business partnerships. And in several recent photos, barely visible in the background, was a man who looked suspiciously like my husband. The most damning photo was from 3 weeks ago, Victoria raising a champagne glass at what appeared to be an upscale restaurant, with the caption, "Celebrating new ventures with amazing partners who believe in taking bold risks." The man sitting across from her was definitely Michael, his face partially obscured, but his distinctive watch, the anniversary gift I'd bought him last year, clearly visible. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I realized the scope of what I was discovering. This wasn't just a financial decision Michael had made without consulting me. This was evidence of a relationship I'd known nothing about, a business partnership that involved my life savings, and a level of deception that made me question everything I thought I knew about my marriage. I'd met Michael when I was 26, fresh from getting my CPA certification and eager to build something meaningful with someone who shared my ambitions. He was already establishing his construction company, full of big dreams about building custom homes and commercial projects that would set us up for life. Our relationship had been built on complementary strengths. His vision and charisma paired with my analytical skills and financial management. For 8 years, it had worked beautifully. Michael's construction projects provided steady income that I channeled into diversified investments, emergency funds, and long-term savings goals. We'd bought our house in Orange County, built substantial retirement accounts, and maintained the kind of financial stability that let us sleep peacefully at night. I'd always been the detail-oriented partner, tracking every expense and monitoring our financial progress with spreadsheets that would have impressed my most demanding clients. Michael was brilliant at estimating project costs and managing construction crews, but he readily admitted that numbers and long-term planning weren't his strengths. He'd been grateful to let me handle our finances, often bragging to friends about how smart I was with investments and budgeting. "Cassia's got the magic touch with money," he'd tell people at dinner parties. "I just build things. She makes sure we can afford to keep building them." That dynamic had worked perfectly, until recently. Over the past few months, Michael had started questioning some of my financial choices. My conservative investment approach was suddenly too safe. Our emergency fund was dead money that could be working harder. My carefully researched retirement planning was boring compared to the real estate opportunities he kept hearing about from other contractors. I'd assume these conversations were just Michael feeling restless about our steady but unspectacular investment returns. Real estate had been booming, and several of his contractor friends had made significant profits flipping houses or investing in rental properties. It seemed natural that he'd be curious about whether we should adjust our strategy. What I hadn't realized was that these weren't theoretical discussions about our financial future. They were Michael laying the groundwork for something he'd already decided to do without me. The more I investigated Victoria Sterling and Meridian property development, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just about money, it was about Michael reinventing himself as the kind of bold entrepreneur he'd apparently always wanted to be, with a younger partner who saw him as adventurous rather than predictable. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Running late tonight. Problem with the Riverside project. Don't wait up." The casual lie hit me like a slap. There was no problem with the Riverside project, I knew, because I'd spoken to the project manager that morning about an invoice. Michael was somewhere else, probably with Victoria, possibly celebrating their new business partnership funded by my life savings. I stared at his message for a long moment, then typed back, "No problem. Hope you get it resolved. Love you." The words felt poisonous to type, but I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to protect myself from whatever was coming next. Because one thing was becoming crystal clear, this wasn't just about a risky investment decision. This was about Michael choosing a completely different life, and he was using our money to fund it. As I sat in our pristine Kit Wesley, surrounded by the home we'd built together, something cold and focused settled in my chest. Michael had made a critical mistake in his grand betrayal. He'd forgotten that I wasn't just good with money, I was excellent at uncovering financial irregularities, and I had 8 years of experience protecting our assets from exactly this kind of disaster. Years ago, when we'd first bought our house, I'd insisted we structure our finances with multiple safeguards: separate business accounts, carefully documented paper trails, and legal protections that would prevent either of us from making devastating unilateral decisions. At the time, Michael had joked that I was being paranoid about worst-case scenarios. Today, that paranoia was about to save my financial future and expose his betrayal in ways he couldn't have imagined. The foundation of our relationship had always been built on trust and shared goals. Michael was the creative visionary who could see potential in rundown properties and transform them into beautiful spaces. I was the strategic planner who made sure his visions became profitable realities without bankrupting us in the process. For 8 years, we'd been the couple other people envied. Financially stable, professionally successful, seemingly unshakable. We'd weathered economic downturns, family crises, and the normal stresses of building careers and maintaining a marriage. I'd thought we were building something permanent, something that would last through whatever challenges life threw at us. But apparently, Michael had started seeing our stability as stagnation, our careful planning as lack of ambition, and my financial expertise as an obstacle to the exciting opportunities he wanted to pursue. The timeline was becoming clearer as I dug deeper into the digital evidence. Michael's interest in real estate investing had coincided almost exactly with his first meeting with Victoria Sterling. What I'd interpreted as natural curiosity about market trends had actually been the beginning of a relationship that was about to cost me everything I'd worked to build. Our marriage had been structured around complementary strengths, but somewhere along the way, Michael had started resenting the very qualities that had made our partnership successful. My careful approach to money had become conservative. My long-term planning had become boring. My track record of steady returns had become unambitious compared to the flashy success stories Victoria was apparently sharing with him. The irony was devastating. While I'd been building our financial security one careful decision at a time, Michael had been falling for someone who represented everything. I wasn't young, reckless, and promising the kind of quick profits that sounded exciting, but could destroy everything we'd built. Now, staring at our emptied savings account, I realized that Michael hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He'd gambled our entire future on a woman who'd convinced him that 8 years of proven financial success meant less than 6 weeks of untested promises. But Michael had made one critical error in his calculations. He'd assumed that I would discover his betrayal and react emotionally, crying, begging, or desperately trying to save a marriage he'd already abandoned. What he didn't understand was that I wasn't going to be the devastated wife pleading for another chance. I was going to be the forensic accountant who systematically destroyed his new venture by exposing every illegal and unethical detail of how it had been funded. My first move was to call our lawyer, David Hawkins, who'd helped us structure our business entities and property purchases over the years. David had always been more than just our attorney. He was a family friend who understood our financial situation and had helped create many of the legal protections I was about to use. "Cassia, what can I do for you?" David's voice was warm and familiar when he answered his direct line. "David, I need to discuss something urgent and confidential. Michael just transferred our entire savings to a company I've never heard of without my authorization, and I have reason to believe this involves more than just a business decision." The pause that followed told me David immediately understood the seriousness of what I was describing. "How much money are we talking about?" $94,000, nearly everything we've saved over 8 years. "When did this happen?" "This afternoon. The transfer went to a company called Meridian Property Development, which was incorporated 6 weeks ago by someone named Victoria Sterling." I could hear David pulling up files on his computer as he processed the information. "Cassia, the co-authorization requirements we built into your financial structure should have prevented any transfer of that size without both signatures. If Michael circumvented those protections, we're looking at potential fraud charges." The word fraud sent a chill through me, but also a sense of vindication. I wasn't overreacting to a marital disagreement about investment strategy. I was responding appropriately to what appeared to be criminal financial conduct. "I need to see you as soon as possible," I told David. "I have evidence that this transfer is connected to a personal relationship Michael has been hiding from me, and I want to understand all my legal options. Can you be here in an hour?" This is exactly the kind of situation where acting quickly makes all the difference. As I gathered financial documents and screenshots of Victoria's social media posts, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: clarity. For weeks, I'd been sensing that something was wrong in my marriage but couldn't identify what it was. Michael had been distracted, critical, and increasingly secretive. but I'd attributed those changes to work stress or normal relationship fluctuations. Now I understood that I hadn't been imagining problems. I'd been detecting the early warning signs of a betrayal so comprehensive that it threatened not just our marriage, but our financial security and my professional reputation. But Michael had underestimated me in every possible way. He'd assumed that 8 years of marriage had made me complacent, that my conservative approach to money meant I was passive, and that his charm and manipulation would keep me confused long enough for him to solidify whatever new life he was building with Victoria. What he didn't realize was that I'd spent 8 years preparing for exactly this scenario. Not because I expected betrayal, but because I believed in protecting our assets from any possible threat, including the threat of one partner making catastrophically bad decisions. Every legal protection we'd put in place, every safeguard I'd insisted on, every backup plan I'd created was about to be deployed against the person who'd inspired me to create them in the first place. David Hawkins' office was exactly as I remembered, understated elegance that projected competence without ostentation. Law books lined the walls, and his desk was organized with the precision of someone who'd built a practice on attention to detail. He was waiting for me when I arrived, having already pulled our files and begun reviewing the legal protections we'd established years earlier. "Show me everything," he said immediately, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I opened my laptop and walked him through the bank records, the wire transfer details, and the documentation I'd found about Meridian Property Development and Victoria Sterling. David's expression remained neutral as he reviewed the evidence, but I could see the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was recognizing patterns he'd seen before. "Your husband made several critical mistakes," David said after reviewing everything. "First, the co-authorization requirements we established specifically prevent either spouse from transferring more than $10,000 without written consent from both parties. This transfer violates that agreement and potentially constitutes fraud." He pulled out a legal pad and began writing notes with the efficiency of someone developing strategy in real time. "Second, if he used deception to circumvent our authorization protocols, which appears to be the case, since you had no knowledge of this transfer, we can argue that this constitutes theft of marital assets. Third, if this money was transferred to fund a personal relationship or benefit a third party rather than a legitimate business investment, Victoria Sterling could be liable for receiving stolen property." The implications were staggering. Not only could I potentially recover our money, but both Michael and Victoria could face serious legal consequences for how they'd obtained it. "But here's what makes this particularly interesting," David continued, leaning back in his chair. "If Michael represented this as a business investment when it's actually funding a personal relationship, and if Victoria accepted money she knew was taken without spousal consent, we're looking at conspiracy charges that could result in criminal prosecution." He pulled up legal precedents on his computer as he outlined our strategy. "We're going to file for emergency relief to freeze all remaining assets and demand immediate return of the transferred funds. We'll also subpoena all records related to Meridian Property Development and investigate whether this is actually a legitimate business entity or a shell company created to hide the transfer of marital assets." But it was David's next suggestion that made me realize how thoroughly Michael had miscalculated. "More importantly, we're going to examine every business transaction Michael has made over the past 6 months. If this relationship with Victoria Sterling has been ongoing, there may be additional transfers or business deals that were motivated by personal rather than professional considerations." The comprehensive audit David was proposing would expose every detail of Michael's recent business activities, including any other ways he might have been using our money to fund his relationship with Victoria. By trying to steal our savings in one dramatic gesture, Michael had triggered an investigation that would uncover everything he'd been hiding. As I left David's office 2 hours later, I felt the strangest combination of devastation and anticipation. My marriage was clearly over, but Michael's betrayal was about to become the biggest mistake of his life. The conservative, predictable wife he'd dismissed as an obstacle to his entrepreneurial dreams was about to demonstrate that careful planning and legal preparation could be far more devastating than any emotional reaction. Wednesday morning brought the first signs that Michael was beginning to suspect something was wrong. He called during my commute to work, his voice carrying a forced casualness that immediately raised red flags. "Hey babe, just checking in. How's your day going?" Michael never called during my commute. In 8 years of marriage, he'd learned that I used my drive time to mentally prepare for client meetings and preferred not to be interrupted unless there was an emergency. "It's fine," I replied, keeping my voice warm and normal. "Just heading to the office. How's your day looking?" "Oh, the usual. Got a couple of site visits scheduled, then I might grab drinks with some of the guys tonight. Networking. You know how it is. Networking. With Victoria Sterling, no doubt." But his transparent lie gave me exactly what I needed: additional time to implement David's strategy, while Michael continued to believe his deception was working. "That sounds great," I told him. "Make sure you get some good business cards. You know how I love seeing our network grow?" The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me. By tonight, Michael would discover that his networking had indeed caused our professional network to grow specifically. It had grown to include forensic accountants, private investigators, and additional attorneys specializing in financial fraud. After hanging up, I spent the morning implementing the strategy David and I had developed. My first call was to our bank's fraud department, reporting unauthorized access to our joint accounts. The representative was immediately concerned when I explained that a large transfer had been made without my knowledge or consent, and she initiated a formal investigation that would freeze any additional transactions until the matter was resolved. My second call was to Rebecca Martinez, a private investigator David had recommended who specialized in financial infidelity cases. Rebecca's approach was systematic and thorough. She would document every aspect of Michael's relationship with Victoria, investigate the legitimacy of Meridian property development, and uncover any additional financial irregularities that might have escaped my initial review. The key to these cases, Rebecca explained during our phone consultation, is establishing a timeline that shows premeditation. If your husband has been planning this for weeks or months, that strengthens your position significantly. If this relationship involves ongoing deception about business activities, it could constitute a pattern of fraud rather than a single bad decision. But it was my third call that provided the most immediate satisfaction. I contacted Jennifer Walsh, a forensic accountant who'd worked with several of my clients during divorce proceedings. Jennifer's specialty was following money trails and exposing hidden assets, skills that would be invaluable in understanding exactly what Michael and Victoria were planning with our stolen savings. "I'll need access to all your financial records," Jennifer explained, "but I'll also be examining public records related to Meridian property development, looking for any property purchases or business transactions that might indicate how your money is being used." The forensic audit Jennifer was proposing would reveal every detail of Victoria's business activities, including whether Meridian Property Development was actually purchasing real estate or simply serving as a vehicle for transferring money from my marriage to Michael's new relationship. By noon, I had initiated investigations that would expose every aspect of Michael's betrayal from multiple angles. Banking authorities were freezing our accounts and investigating potential fraud. A private investigator was documenting his relationship with Victoria and examining the legitimacy of their business partnership. A forensic accountant was following our money to determine exactly how it was being used. Michael thought he was moving quickly and decisively to start his new life. What he didn't realize was that he'd triggered a comprehensive investigation that would expose every detail of his plans and potentially destroy both his construction business and Victoria's real estate career. Thursday afternoon brought the first tangible results of our investigation, and they exceeded even my worst expectations. Rebecca Martinez called with preliminary findings that painted a picture of deception far more extensive than I'd imagined. Your husband's relationship with Victoria Sterling goes back at least 4 months, Rebecca reported. I've found evidence of multiple meetings, shared meals, and what appears to be overnight travel together. But more importantly, this isn't his first financial transaction with her company. My stomach dropped as I processed the implications. What do you mean? Over the past 6 weeks, there have been 3 smaller transfers from your business accounts to Meridian Property Development, amounts ranging from $5,000 to $8,000, all below the thresholds that would have triggered your authorization requirements. The systematic nature of what Michael had been doing hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a single impulsive decision or even a relationship that had suddenly turned financial. This was a carefully planned campaign to gradually transfer our assets to Victoria's business while avoiding the legal protections I'd established. There's more, Rebecca continued. Jennifer's forensic audit has revealed that Meridian Property Development hasn't purchased any real estate since it was incorporated. The money your husband transferred isn't being used for property investments. It's sitting in business accounts that appear to be controlled solely by Victoria Sterling. The revelation was devastating, but also clarifying. Michael hadn't just betrayed our marriage by having an affair. He hadn't even betrayed our marriage by making a risky business investment. He had systematically stolen our money to fund what appeared to be a complete financial transfer to his girlfriend. Based on the evidence we've gathered, Rebecca added, this appears to be a planned exit strategy. Your husband has been gradually moving assets to Victoria's control while maintaining the appearance of normal business operations. The large transfer that triggered your investigation was probably meant to be the final step before he informed you that your marriage was over. The premeditation was staggering. While I'd been updating our investment spreadsheets and planning our financial future, Michael had been executing a plan to steal everything we'd built and leave me with nothing but debt and the remnants of his construction business. But Michael's systematic approach to betrayal had created a systematic evidence trail that would be impossible to explain away or dismiss as misunderstandings. Every transfer, every meeting, every lie could be documented and presented as part of a comprehensive pattern of fraud. Jennifer Walsh's forensic analysis provided even more damaging details. The smaller transfers Michael had been making weren't just to avoid authorization thresholds. They were timed to coincide with specific business activities that would make them appear legitimate to anyone conducting a casual review. He's been very clever about this, Jennifer explained during our afternoon call. Each transfer was documented as payment for consulting services or project analysis, making them appear to be normal business expenses. If you hadn't been monitoring your accounts so closely, you might not have noticed these transactions for months. But Jennifer's investigation had revealed that none of these supposed consulting services had actually been provided. Meridian Property Development had no track record of legitimate business activities, no client base beyond Michael, and no assets beyond the money he'd transferred from our accounts. This isn't a real estate investment company, Jennifer concluded. It's a shell entity created specifically to receive and hold marital assets that were transferred without proper authorization. If I were presenting this evidence in court, I'd argue that Meridian Property Development exists solely to facilitate the theft of your money. The legal implications were becoming clearer with each piece of evidence we uncovered. Michael hadn't just made a bad investment decision, he'd created a fraudulent business relationship to systematically steal marital assets. Victoria hadn't just accepted money from a married man, she'd participated in creating a fake business entity to hide the source and purpose of those funds. By Thursday evening, I had evidence of premeditated fraud, systematic financial deception, and conspiracy to steal marital assets. Michael's betrayal had evolved from a personal crisis into a criminal case that could result in serious legal consequences for both him and Victoria. But the most satisfying aspect of our investigation was how completely it contradicted the narrative Michael had apparently constructed about our relationship. He'd portrayed me as the conservative, unambitious partner who was holding him back from exciting opportunities. In reality, I'd been the one building a comprehensive case that would expose his supposed exciting opportunity as a criminal conspiracy. Friday morning brought the moment I'd been waiting for, and dreading in equal measure. David called at 8:30 a.m. with news that would change everything. "The emergency motions have been approved," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd executed a perfect legal strategy. "All remaining joint accounts are frozen, effective immediately. Michael won't be able to access any marital assets until this matter is resolved in court." But that was just the beginning. More importantly, we've obtained a court order requiring Victoria Sterling to place the transferred funds in escrow pending investigation of how they were obtained. If she refuses to comply, she'll be in contempt of court and potentially facing criminal charges for receiving stolen property. The comprehensive legal assault we'd prepared was about to hit both Michael and Victoria simultaneously. While they'd been celebrating their new business partnership and planning their future together, we'd been building a case that would destroy both their relationship and their financial security. "There's one more thing," David added, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "The subpoenas for Michael's business records have been served. By Monday morning, we'll have complete documentation of every financial transaction he's made over the past 6 months, including any other ways he might have been using business funds to support his relationship with Victoria." The audit that would result from those subpoenas would expose every detail of Michael's recent business activities, potentially revealing additional fraud beyond what we'd already discovered. His attempt to start fresh with Victoria was about to trigger an investigation that would destroy his existing business as well. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the power dynamic in my marriage had shifted completely. For months, Michael had been the one making secret plans, controlling information, and determining our future without my input. Now I was the one with superior information, legal representation, and a strategy that would expose every aspect of his deception. The conservative, predictable wife he'd dismissed as an obstacle to his dreams was about to demonstrate that careful planning and thorough preparation could be infinitely more devastating than any emotional reaction. Michael's first hint that something was wrong came Friday afternoon when he tried to access our joint checking account to pay for lunch and discovered that his debit card had been declined. His first call was to the bank, where he was informed that the account had been frozen due to suspicious activity and that he'd need to contact their fraud department for more information. His second call was to me, and his voice carried an edge of panic that he couldn't quite hide. "Cassia, something's wrong with our bank accounts. They're saying there's some kind of fraud investigation and everything's been frozen. Do you know anything about this?" I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding with carefully calibrated concern. "That's terrible, Michael. When did this happen? I haven't received any calls from the bank." "Just now. I tried to buy lunch and my card was declined. The bank says they sent notices to both of us about suspicious activity." Of course they had. The notices had been sent to our home address, where I'd intercepted them before Michael returned from his supposed business meetings with Victoria. "How strange," I said, injecting just the right amount of confusion into my voice. "Maybe you should come home so we can figure this out together. I'm sure it's just some kind of misunderstanding." But Michael's next words revealed that his problems extended far beyond our personal banking. "There's something else, Cassia. Someone from a law firm called my office today, asking about business records and financial documentation. My secretary said they had some kind of court order." The comprehensive legal strategy we'd implemented was beginning to hit Michael from multiple directions simultaneously. Banking authorities were investigating fraud, courts were freezing assets, and legal subpoenas were exposing his business activities to scrutiny that would reveal every detail of his deception. "That sounds serious, Michael. Maybe you should call our lawyer and see what David thinks about all this." The irony, of course, was that David was the architect of the legal assault that was currently destroying Michael's life. But I wanted Michael to discover that fact, in the most devastating way possible, by calling for help from the very person who was orchestrating his downfall. "Yeah, that's a good idea," Michael said, his voice tight with stress. "I'll call David right now." As I hung up the phone, I imagined David's satisfaction at receiving that call. The client who'd ignored legal advice about protecting marital assets was about to discover that his wife had been following that advice with devastating efficiency. Michael's education in the consequences of financial betrayal was about to begin, and I was going to have a front row seat to watch his carefully constructed new life collapse in real time. When Michael finally arrived home Friday evening, he looked like a man who'd spent the day receiving one piece of devastating news after another. His designer clothes were wrinkled. His usual confidence had been replaced by barely controlled panic, and his eyes held the wild look of someone who was beginning to understand that his world was collapsing. I was waiting in our living room with a cup of tea and a manila folder full of documents he'd never seen before. "We need to talk," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door with uncharacteristic carelessness. "Yes, we do," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. "Sit down, Michael. Let's discuss your real estate investments." The color drained from his face as he recognized some of the documents spilling out of my folder: bank records, screenshots of Victoria's social media posts, and legal papers that would change his life forever. "Cassia, I can explain everything." "I'm sure you can," I interrupted, my voice calm and controlled. "But first, let me explain what I've discovered." I opened the folder and began laying out evidence with the methodical precision I'd learned from years of forensic accounting. Bank records showing the unauthorized transfers, social media posts proving his relationship with Victoria, legal documents demonstrating that Meridian Property Development was a shell company with no legitimate business activities. "This is what fraud looks like, Michael," I said, pointing to the wire transfer records. "This is what theft of marital assets looks like. And this," I handed him the court orders freezing our accounts and demanding return of the stolen funds, "is what happens when someone thinks they're smarter than the legal protections we spent years putting in place." Michael's face cycled through shock, denial, and finally a kind of desperate calculation as he tried to figure out how much I knew and whether there was any way to salvage his situation. "Cassia, you don't understand. This isn't what it looks like. Victoria and I are building something real, something that could set us up for life. The real estate market is exploding right now, and she has connections that could make us millions." The casual admission that he'd stolen our money for Victoria and I, rather than us, was breathtaking in its honesty. Michael was so focused on justifying his actions that he'd forgotten to maintain the pretense that this was about our marriage rather than his exit strategy. "Really?" I asked, my voice deceptively mild. "Tell me about these real estate investments. Which properties has Meridian Property Development purchased? What's the timeline for returns on our investment? Where are the contracts and legal documentation for these supposedly lucrative deals?" Michael's silence told me everything I needed to know. There were no properties, no investments, no business plan beyond transferring our money to Victoria's personal control. His grand entrepreneurial venture was nothing more than an elaborate theft disguised as ambition. "You can't do this, Cassia," Michael said finally, his voice taking on the edge of desperation. "Those accounts belong to both of us. You can't just freeze everything without talking to me first." The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. "You're absolutely right, Michael. Joint accounts belong to both spouses, and major financial decisions should always involve consultation and mutual consent. Exactly like the co-authorization agreements we signed when we established those accounts. Remember those agreements? The ones that required both our signatures for any transfer over $10,000? I pulled out copies of the legal documents he'd apparently forgotten about in his excitement over funding his new life with Victoria. "These are the agreements you violated when you transferred $94,500 without my knowledge or consent. These are the legal protections that make your actions constitute fraud rather than just poor communication. Michael stared at the documents as if he'd never seen them before, his face reflecting the dawning realization that his betrayal hadn't just destroyed our marriage, it had potentially destroyed his freedom. But this is also what happens, I continued, pulling out the final set of documents, when someone underestimates their spouse so completely that they trigger a comprehensive investigation into every aspect of their financial activities. The subpoenas for his business records, the forensic audit of his relationship with Victoria, the criminal investigation into Meridian property development, everything that would expose the full scope of his deception and potentially send both him and Victoria to prison. As Michael read through the legal documents that would define his immediate future, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete clarity about who I was and what I was capable of accomplishing. For years, I'd been the supportive wife who made Michael's success possible through careful planning and financial management. I'd been content to work behind the scenes, building our security while he received credit for our achievements. I'd believed that our partnership was built on mutual respect and shared goals. But Michael's betrayal had revealed that he'd never truly valued my contributions. He'd seen my financial expertise as a service he was entitled to, rather than a partnership he was grateful for. He'd interpreted my conservative approach as lack of ambition rather than intelligent risk management. Most devastatingly, he'd believed that 8 years of making his dreams possible meant I had no dreams of my own worth protecting. Now Michael was discovering that the quiet, methodical wife he'd taken for granted was actually the most dangerous opponent he could have chosen. Every skill I'd used to build our financial security was being deployed to expose his betrayal and protect what remained of our assets. Every legal protection I'd insisted on was being used to demonstrate that his actions constituted criminal fraud rather than marital disagreement. The conservative approach he'd dismissed as boring had created an evidence trail so comprehensive that no lawyer would be able to argue his way out of the consequences. The attention to detail he'd found tedious had documented every aspect of his deception with forensic precision. The long-term planning he'd found limiting had prepared me for exactly this scenario years before he'd even met Victoria Sterling. As Michael sat in our living room, reading legal documents that would likely send him to prison, I realized that revenge, when executed with intelligence and preparation, wasn't just satisfying, it was devastatingly effective. The husband who'd thought he could steal our life savings and start over with a younger woman was about to learn that underestimating your spouse is the most expensive mistake anyone can make. Saturday morning brought news that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. David called at 9 a.m. with updates that would permanently alter the trajectory of both Michael's and Victoria's lives. Victoria Sterling has retained an attorney, he reported, but her legal problems are far more extensive than she apparently realized. The forensic audit has revealed that Meridian property development was used to receive funds from 3 other married men over the past 6 months. The implications hit me immediately. Victoria wasn't just a naive young woman who'd made poor decisions about accepting money from my husband. She was operating a systematic scheme to extract money from married men, using the promise of real estate investments to hide what appeared to be a sophisticated fraud operation. This changes everything, David continued. What we initially treated as marital fraud is actually part of a larger criminal enterprise. The FBI has been notified, and they're opening a full investigation into Victoria Sterling's activities. The room seemed to tilt as I processed this revelation. My husband hadn't just betrayed me with a younger woman. He'd become involved with someone who was apparently running a sophisticated con game targeting married men. "How many other victims are there?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "At least 3 that we've identified so far, but the investigation is just beginning. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Victoria targets successful married men in construction or real estate, convinces them to invest in her property development company, and then the money disappears into accounts she controls exclusively." I thought about all those networking events Michael had attended recently, all those new business contacts he'd been so excited about. Had Victoria been working her way through Orange County's construction community, identifying the most successful married contractors and targeting them systematically? There's more, David added. The other victims have been convinced to mortgage their homes and liquidate retirement accounts. Your husband's theft of $94,500 might actually be the smallest amount involved in this scheme. The scope of Victoria's operation was staggering, but it also provided a crucial advantage for our case. Michael wasn't just facing charges for stealing our money. He was potentially facing federal charges for participating in a criminal conspiracy that had defrauded multiple families. What does this mean for Michael specifically? Well, if he was a knowing participant in Victoria's scheme, he could be facing conspiracy charges, wire fraud, and money laundering, all federal crimes with significant prison sentences. If he was just a victim who got caught up in her operation, he might be able to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. The choice facing Michael was becoming clear. Cooperate with federal investigators by providing evidence against Victoria, or maintain loyalty to his girlfriend and face the full consequences of participating in a criminal enterprise. But given Michael's personality and his talent for self-preservation, I suspected he'd choose cooperation the moment he understood the alternative was federal prison. By Saturday afternoon, the FBI's involvement had transformed our quiet suburban neighborhood into the center of a criminal investigation. 2 black SUVs were parked outside our house, and federal agents were executing search warrants for all of Michael's business records, computer files, and communications with Victoria Sterling. I watched from our living room window as agents carried box after box of evidence from Michael's home office financial records, contracts, client files, and computer equipment that would provide a complete picture of his recent business activities. Michael sat at our Kit Wesley table, flanked by his new criminal defense attorney, looking like a man who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd gotten himself into. The confident entrepreneur who'd been planning his exciting new life just days ago had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely terrified of spending the next decade in federal prison. Agent Rebecca Torres, the lead FBI investigator, had been remarkably professional and sympathetic when she interviewed me earlier that morning. She'd explained that I was considered a victim rather than a suspect, and that my cooperation with their investigation would be crucial to understanding the full scope of Victoria's criminal operation. Mrs. Wesley, based on the evidence your attorney provided, it appears your husband was targeted by Miss Sterling using a specific methodology she's employed with other victims, Agent Torres had explained. She identifies successful married men, establishes personal relationships with them, and then convinces them to invest in fake business opportunities that exist solely to transfer their assets to accounts she controls. The systematic nature of Victoria's approach had been eye-opening. She hadn't just happened to meet Michael at a networking event. She'd researched his business, identified him as a potential target, and then engineered their meeting to appear accidental. "How long has she been doing this?" I'd asked. "We're still investigating, but we believe this particular scheme has been operating for at least 18 months. Miss Sterling appears to have refined her approach over time, learning from each victim about the most effective ways to extract money from married men, without immediately alerting their spouses." The clinical description of Victoria's methodology made Michael's betrayal seem almost predictable, rather than personal. He hadn't been special or chosen. He'd been selected as a target based on financial profile and psychological vulnerability. But that didn't make his decision to steal our money any less devastating or criminal. Sunday morning brought the news I'd been hoping for since this nightmare began. Michael's criminal defense attorney called David with a proposal that would finally bring some justice to the situation. "Your husband wants to cooperate with the federal investigation," David reported during our phone call. He's willing to provide complete testimony about his relationship with Victoria Sterling and turn over all records related to Meridian property development in exchange for reduced charges. The terms of Michael's cooperation would be comprehensive. He'd testify about how Victoria had approached him, how she'd convinced him to invest our money, and what he knew about her relationships with other victims. More importantly, he'd help federal investigators understand the psychological manipulation techniques Victoria had used to convince multiple successful men to betray their families. "What about our money?" I asked. "That's where things get interesting. The FBI has identified accounts containing over $400,000 that they believe contains funds stolen from Victoria's various victims. As part of any plea agreement, Michael will be required to help recover all stolen funds and make full restitution to every victim. The financial recovery would be more comprehensive than I dared hope. Not only would I get our $94,500 back, but Michael would be required to pay additional penalties and cover all legal costs associated with the investigation and recovery process. But the most satisfying aspect of Michael's cooperation agreement was in that it would expose every detail of his relationship with Victoria to federal investigators, prosecutors, and eventually a jury. The secret affair he'd been so careful to hide would become part of the public record in a federal criminal case. "There's one more thing," David added. As part of his cooperation, Michael has agreed to a complete financial disclosure that will reveal any other assets or accounts he might have been hiding. The forensic audit will continue until investigators are satisfied that they've recovered every dollar involved in this scheme. The comprehensive financial investigation that Michael's cooperation would trigger meant that any other secrets he'd been keeping would be exposed. If he'd been hiding additional money, planning other betrayals, or involved in any other questionable activities, everything would come to light as part of the federal case. By Sunday evening, the broad outlines of our new reality were becoming clear. Michael would avoid the most serious federal charges by cooperating against Victoria, but he'd still face state charges for theft of marital assets and potentially lose his contractor's license. Our money would be recovered, but our marriage was obviously over. More importantly, Victoria Sterling's criminal enterprise was about to be exposed in ways that would not only send her to federal prison, but also warn other potential victims about the dangers of mixing business with personal relationships. As I sat in our living room, surrounded by the remnants of the life Michael and I had built together, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Not for the betrayal itself, but for discovering it early enough to protect myself and potentially save other families from the same devastation. Michael's attempt to steal our future had inadvertently exposed a criminal scheme that could have continued for years, destroying dozens of marriages and families. His betrayal of our trust had led to federal charges that would ensure Victoria could never victimize another married couple. The conservative, methodical approach he'd dismissed as boring had not only protected our assets, but also provided law enforcement with the evidence they needed to stop a sophisticated criminal operation. In trying to escape what he saw as a predictable life with me, Michael had stumbled into a federal criminal case that would define the rest of his life. The exciting new adventure he'd chosen over our marriage was about to become a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting personal desires override legal and ethical boundaries. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom watching Victoria Sterling receive a 7-year prison sentence for operating a criminal enterprise that had defrauded 11 married couples of over $800,000. Michael, true to his character, had cooperated fully with investigators and received a reduced sentence of 18 months in minimum security prison, plus 5 years of probation. The recovery of our assets had been complete. Not only had I gotten back every dollar Michael had stolen, but the additional penalties and restitution requirements meant our financial position was actually stronger than it had been before his betrayal. The conservative investment approach he'd criticized had protected our core assets, while his exciting adventure had cost him his business, his freedom, and his future. Our divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, with terms that reflected both his criminal conduct and his cooperation with federal authorities. I'd kept the house, the majority of our assets, and full ownership of the accounting firm I'd built while supporting his career. Michael had kept his legal obligations to continue making restitution payments to all of Victoria's victims for the next decade. But the most satisfying outcome hadn't been financial. It had been watching a systematic criminal operation exposed and shut down before it could destroy more families. The other victims had all recovered their stolen funds, and several had used the experience to strengthen their own marriages rather than let Victoria's manipulation destroy them. As I left the courthouse that day, I realized that Michael's betrayal had taught me something crucial about my own capabilities. For 8 years, I'd been the supportive partner who made someone else's success possible. I'd been content to work behind the scenes, providing the financial foundation that allowed Michael to pursue his dreams. But his betrayal had revealed that I was capable of far more than just supporting someone else's ambitions. When faced with a crisis that threatened everything I'd worked to build, I'd responded with strategic thinking, comprehensive planning, and ruthless execution that had not only protected my interests, but also served the cause of justice. The quiet, methodical wife Michael had underestimated had become the key witness in a federal criminal case that would be studied by law enforcement as an example of how financial crimes could be detected and prosecuted through careful documentation and strategic legal action. 3 years after Michael's betrayal, I was running the most successful forensic accounting practice in Orange County, specializing in cases involving financial infidelity and marital asset protection. My experience with Victoria Sterling's criminal scheme had made me a recognized expert in detecting and preventing the kind of sophisticated fraud that targets married couples. The skills I developed during my own crisis systematic investigation, comprehensive documentation, and strategic legal planning had become the foundation of a practice that helped other victims of financial betrayal recover their assets and rebuild their lives. I'd also remarried to David Hawkins, the attorney who'd helped me navigate the crisis that ended my first marriage. Our relationship was built on mutual respect for each other's professional capabilities and shared understanding of the importance of protecting the assets and trust that make successful partnerships possible. But most importantly, I'd learned that the conservative, careful approach to life that Michael had dismissed as limiting was actually a source of tremendous strength. The same methodical preparation that he'd found boring had enabled me to respond to crisis with confidence and effectiveness. The same attention to detail he'd considered obsessive had provided the evidence needed to expose a criminal scheme and protect other families from similar betrayal. Michael had thought he was escaping a predictable life with a predictable wife. Instead, he'd discovered that predictability, when combined with intelligence and determination, could be the most devastating force he'd ever encountered. The last I heard, he was working construction for someone else's company, living in a small apartment, and still making monthly restitution payments to Victoria's victims. His exciting adventure with a younger woman had cost him everything he'd built and left him with nothing but legal obligations and regrets. Victoria Sterling was serving her sentence in federal prison, her real estate career permanently destroyed, and her future defined by the criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. And I was living the life I'd always wanted: professionally successful, financially secure, and married to someone who valued my contributions as much as I valued his. The betrayal that was supposed to destroy me had instead revealed capabilities I'd never known I possessed, and led to a future far more satisfying than anything I could have imagined while married to Michael. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's discovering that you're capable of far more than the person who betrayed you ever imagined, and building a life so successful that their betrayal becomes irrelevant to your happiness. The conservative, predictable wife Michael had left behind no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that careful planning and methodical execution weren't limitations. They were superpowers that could overcome any challenge and create any future she chose to build.